Welcome to CERT's IT Service Solution Podcast. In this episode, our host, Jon Grainger, CTIO, talks to George Bathurst, who is a director at B.net. With George's extensive knowledge and experience in cybersecurity, he will share his insights on the development and driving forces behind Secure by Design. Let's dive in.
Hey George, it's great to meet you, and very excited to be talking together on this podcast for certs. Security is an extremely important topic. A lot of people say that, pay lip service to it, and then there's others who kind of live it for real. And I've got a feeling I might be meeting one of those real life silent heroes in security. I was looking at a bit of your background and the sort of stuff that you've done. And obviously, most of it we probably can never talk about. It's absolute privilege to have you here on the podcast today. Before we get started, I used to have this expression, which is pinched from a famous movie, which you'll guess, which is the first rule of Sock Club isn't to talk about Sock Club, from the Fight Club movie. So I just wanted to kind of set everyone who's listening or perhaps watching this that George and I will talk about examples, but probably in more of the abstract sense, and we won't be talking about anything kind of specific. And just so everyone understands, that's the approach, and it's a very good approach. I think anyone should take listening to this if you're ever asked to speak in a public forum about security. George, before we get into your background, do you agree the first rule of Sock Club is not to talk about Sock Club, or maybe the first rule of Sock Club is to talk about Sock Club, because you're kind of doing a bit of both? What's your take on that?
Hi, John. It's I think one of the interesting things about risk management is that the big risks that people are talking about are often not secret at all. It's like losing a war or losing your capability, or the NHS losing its scans today. Those are the things that actually can be talked about openly. The things that can't be talked about are the details, the firewall rules, and all those sort of stuffs. And quite often people get those confused with risks, and then they end up not having constructive conversations because they're too hamstrung by the wrong sort of technical constraints.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. George, I think lots of people listening have learned something straight off the bat there. But George, before we get stuck in, I've obviously seen your background, in LinkedIn, and we were briefly introduced. But it would be great for the folks that are listening to hear a little bit about, what's got you to today, your career moments, and a little bit about. I don't want you to hold back, and there's obviously modesty and all the rest of it. But you are, in my opinion, coming from a position of authority on this topic. So maybe just share a little bit about your background and why are you so passionate about security?
Well, I think I've been doing. I'm an electronic engineer, so I think all engineers are passionate about things that work and building things. And my first job was as a scientist for the Navy, actually doing submarine sonar, so nothing to do with security except very tangentially, I suppose. And I spent a lot of time and have fun doing all that. But then I left defence, and I've done a lot of work really, but always in IT or sorts of areas like that for Hewlett Packard, for Mars, and building systems. And but I've also set up my own companies, and we had to do webcams and CCTV and things like that. That eventually, that was my journey into cybersecurity, really, rather the physical route actually. And gradually, I found myself doing very valuable information exchange over the internet using webcams, quite often sometimes involving children, and having to secure that. And this was really before cybersecurity was even a thing. So really, I feel myself being there sort of from the very beginning of the very basics, and setting
I love it.
network masks myself from the very basics right up to now. Really, what I've been doing for the MOD most recently and other clients is helping them set the cultural conditions for making a success of their security.
Okay, well, look, it's cultural conditions. So I'm an engineer as well. We share some of the letters between us. Sort of cousins, but I'm the computer science side of things. So just thinking around security and security by design. So do you want to just sort of tee up broadly where security by design has come from. Obviously, just as a sentence, it can kind of have a literal meaning. But in terms of what, where has that come from? What's driven it in terms of, and actually, when did it first appear?
Yes, and if in retrospect we probably wouldn't choose this name because it causes confusion, and you've just fallen into one of those traps yourself, actually, John, which is calling it
Oh,
security by design, and there are all sorts of different variations of this. I spoke
and I
to
should have said secure by design.
secure by design is what the UK government is using, and this is different from security by design, which quite I think comes from the CPNI, which is really about how you secure a site with
Okay.
sensors and CCTV. There's the Americans though, who have a different definition of secure by design, which is more about or secured by design, past tense, which is quite often about Internet of Things and getting rid of default passwords and things like that.
Okay, so we've got the semantics and the
We've got
naming
the,
of it.
what it not is, yes.
Yeah, what it not is,
Yeah,
and also we're going to get into the principles of it, so people have
yes.
got the kind of what is it actually anchored on. But did it come from so it's come from public sector? Has it been basically like a cementing a load of learnings into one space, or was it a kind of a reaction to a macro threat, or what's driven it through? Because it's I think it's a very, very powerful set of principles, which we'll get into very, very shortly. But I just want to understand what's driving it.
Well, what's driven it really is that the MOD and other government departments, when they've had internal audits, or even in other countries, it's not unique to the UK, have discovered that the current security processes simply aren't working. So they might have had UK governments and NATO countries all use something called accreditation, where they literally give a certificate out to say you are secure, well done, come back in 3 years. And when they've done pen tests or other tests on those things, they've found it almost trivially easy to breach in some cases. And these are not just peripheral systems, these are core weapon systems, core capabilities for the UK so that we can all talk to each other in an emergency, all sorts of
Would it be fair to say stuff that we don't really want
not to
to be
work. Yes, yeah,
not
yeah,
working, not to be
yeah,
secure? Yeah,
and not just in defence. We just this week, as I've said, we've the NHS has again lost very valuable data of patients who
yeah,
we don't want people to die. It's as serious as that, and so the government recognising that had a problem, but didn't necessarily know how to fix it. So they had a
yeah,
process that you could have argued in theory was correct. You build something, you get somebody to check that it's all secure, and then you go stamp it's ready to go out to the real world. But that approach doesn't work, and it didn't work any more than it does in industry when you're making cars. Having QA at the end of the production line was the reason we had such unreliable cars back in the 70s, and all the DevOps
yeah,
movement and things like that have come around really to help people build quality in as they go rather than
yeah,
at the
yeah.
end.
That's really interesting that it's in that family, because that goes under the heading of the cost of remedying a quality issue early on is kind of factorially cheaper than fixing it at the end. If you build a
Yes.
car that hasn't got enough wheels, that's a really big deal to discover it at that stage. Whereas second day in on design saying I think you haven't got enough wheels is just an extra wheel on the drawing. That's
Yes.
the cost to remediate. I think also, isn't it because of the complexity? And so with APIs and modern systems that talk to each other, there are, and also just the number of ports that you have available, etc. Put all of that in the mix. It's really difficult to do that through a checklist. You've got to sort of say, actually, this entire thing at its very core has had security principles running from it from day one.
Exactly, yes. And we had one example that was part of our early exploration with government is a very critical network was fundamentally insecure. And because it was built on insecure foundations, and it didn't matter what they did to it, it was never going to be secure. And
Yeah,
they were stuck in a contract with a big supplier who'd also been involved in multiple other scandals as well, but I won't name them. And that was never going to be fixed by controls and security
yeah,
controls. That had to be a new commercial approach and a new whole different approach to how they do security. And the poor guy at
yeah.
the end of the production line was never going to be able to fix that for them because that's where you
No.
spent literally billions of pounds. Those decisions need to take security into account.
no clipboard is that effective at the end of
Yes.
that. You're not going to be able to deal with it. So it's an interesting thing. I think you and I have got a little bit of a shared era-ish time zone, time-wise, that I was looking at. And one of the things I observed was in the, I don't know, I won't go back too far, reveal too much of my age, but certainly the late 90s, early noughties, there was so much going on that I'm going to just pick some really obvious examples, but putting a fixed IP address into, or even worse, a fixed account and password into some code. There weren't people that were potentially, maybe things weren't even being designed, let alone secure by design. For folks that aren't technical at all, it really is the Wizard of Oz curtain. That we need. Sometimes we forget that it's just almost completely magical what's happening in technology to people who aren't technical. Whereas something like a fixed IP address or a password and account, to anyone who's vaguely technical now knows that's an absolute no-no. I'm just thinking, you're talking about the cultural side of it. When did we kind of start to wrangle that? Do you think it's getting worse or better? It was bad old days, etc. What do you think?
I still think what I call the perimeter security model is still pervasive. So there are many people, and I do come across very technical people, Exchange server administrators, programmers, who think that somebody else is doing security for them. And they assume that the site is secure, or they're moving their on-prem to the cloud, and they're saying, "Oh, Microsoft's going to look after all our security now," and that's just a perimeter security model. And in the cloud, what they should be doing is thinking, well, assuming breach. And what's changed, I think, is that it was a reasonable assumption, arguably 20 years ago, that your site was secure and you could run code unprotected in that. It's no longer a reasonable assumption, and that's where the MOD got to a few years ago, where they realized, guys, stop, this really isn't working.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think what you're talking about, the difference between going to the cloud and going to SaaS is quite different. You're going to cloud, you're taking whatever you've got, you're just putting it in a very, very well run data center. It's a bit more than that, but with economies of scale and all the rest of it. But if you don't implement MFA in the cloud or on-prem, it's you might even say arguably it's worse in the cloud. But either way, bad designs can be very easily transferred. I suppose that's what cloud allows us to do: take a bad design and put it global
and scale it. Yes.
Scalable bad design.
Yeah.
So that's really, really interesting. Just a quick one. Where do you stand on MFA? And I'm a kind of a bit of a don't take anyone seriously who doesn't have MFA. By the way, I'm not saying MFA is a magic bullet and there is MFA policy, so not all MFAs are created the same. I don't mean it as glib as that, but I'm just saying if you don't have an additional factor, you are really on a kind of like a 101 level opening yourself up. But I've got an expert here. What do you think? Is it as simple as that, or is there something else I should be more worried about?
There are some basics that if you haven't got in place, you are in. It's not a risk. It's just it's a risk in the sense that standing in the fast lane of a motorway is a risk. Sooner or later something bad's going to happen, or probably sooner.
It's a risk with a probability of 1.
Yes, or very close to it. Yes, so patching, not getting your patching. Is an accident waiting to happen. Not having MFA, not having a full list of your estate. First question a security person should be asking is, what is it that I am securing?
And where is it?
Why? What is the impact of losing it? So all those are really basic questions. If they're not being done, all the flash stuff doesn't really add much.
Just on the patching side, I think we move into some of the principles next. But just on the patching side, what I would say to folks that are listening is be very bold about patching. Sometimes tech teams can feel very, we don't want to disrupt the business. Now, when I talk about disruption, George, maybe disrupting the business when it's MOD is a different consideration, okay? But if you take sort of non-military, my initial principle would be, if you need to patch and that's going to cause some disruption, you're better to plan that disruption and do it quickly than to say, oh, well, we never patched because we didn't want to. There's a kind of, you can see, like that you were talking about that culture where people think someone else is looking after the perimeter. I think there can be an issue, and don't we also have an issue where we collectively haven't secured the investment to move on with some of the legacy items that we have, and the patching argument's just too esoteric for it to be understood at a certain level, and therefore it doesn't get funded. But we're kind of moving into the fast lane of the motorway, to use your analogy. What's your view on that?
The NCSE do a great series of what they call anti-patterns, and building an unpatchable system is one of their anti-patterns. So people have actually not just designed it or run out of money, because they've actually designed it so that it cannot be patched. And it's not just the military do this; it's banks and everybody. Yeah.
So using your analogy, that's like buying a car that just edges itself into the fast lane and then stops.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But by design, it's security, not security by design. I've taken a list of what I think are the 10 design principles. What I'd like to do is just rattle them off very quickly to make sure we're on the same page. So I'm not about to ask you about Internet of Things or how to physically secure, if I started talking to you about fencing. So the 10 principles I've got is create responsibility for cybersecurity risk. So create responsibility, get secure products, adopt a risk-driven approach, design usable security controls, build in detect and respond security, design flexible architectures, minimize the attack surface, defend in depth, embed continuous assurance, and make your changes securely. These are a great set. Have I quoted the right set of principles, George?
You have, but those are the UK Cabinet Office ones, which are in beta, I think, at the moment. So they're their principles. The MOD has some different principles.
Your knowledge is encyclopedic. This is incredible. Go on.
And
let's get on to the core ones.
There's the UK ones, and there's also the National Cybersecurity Centre. They have their own principles for secure by design as well. So you might be asking, well, how do I make sense if I'm trying to supply to government or I'm trying to follow the government best practice? How do I make sense of all these principles? Because they are all great principles as well. So the MOD principles are great too. So I usually advise people to take a little step back actually from that and think, okay, what is secure by design? And the best definition I've come across is Christine Maxwell's one, who's the CISO for the MOD, saying in 6 words, it is securing capabilities through continual risk management. And that's really important because, first of all, it's about securing capabilities. It's not about doing it because security says so. So a lot of people on the old accreditation mindset is somebody else is going to tell me this is okay, which actually a lot of people who are not doing their job well love, because actually somebody else responsible for security, I don't understand it, it's behind the magic curtain, all that sort of stuff. And then it's continual. It's from the very beginning right to the very end. Even before you've started, you should start thinking about security. So if you want to design a secure network, for example, don't go to a tier 3 or somebody who's running a network on somebody else's network, because it's never going to happen. So even before you've made some really fundamental decisions about who's going to bid for this contract, you need to make those decisions. And then risk management. What do we even mean by risk management? And quite often in government and elsewhere, that's technical. I give that to technical people. And you end up then having technical risks, which in my view is a contradiction in terms, because risks have to include business impacts. And then you then start to say, okay, now I'm giving myself reasons for doing all those really good secure principles that you just listed off, for example. So having defense in depth, well, that's a great principle, but it's also expensive. Because I need to have, and now why should my client be paying for that when he could have had a bigger gun or a faster network or whatever?
Yeah, the opportunity cost
exactly
goes against it. And also, completely secure by design is something that doesn't do anything. It's just a rock that can't be moved or something.
Yes, yeah.
So look, before we get into that part, one of the things you get a challenge with if you do anything global is ultimately there are lots of different sort of standards around the same topic in lots of different domains, data, and, security, etc. So you've mentioned, I think 3 or 4 sources just within the UK public sector, who are all talking about broadly the same topic. So one of the approaches you can take is to go for the highest level. Now, we've got to remember the point you just said about defending depth and cost and cost benefit, etc., and being appropriate. Okay, so taking that to aside, but is it really obvious, like the one in the MOD is the highest and the one in somewhere else is the lowest, or are they broadly the same, or are they all fixing slightly different problems? So folks that are listening shouldn't be saying, well, actually, I'll go and copy the ones out of the MOD because they probably are just cliched, are probably the toughest ones to do. It might be entirely inappropriate. So even though everyone unfortunately is using very similar terminology, is there a horses for courses element to this, or are they much of a muchness, or what's your take on that?
I think it's captured in the key two words, which is risk management. So if you're doing risk management well, you are automatically having horses for courses. You are automatically proportionate. You're automatically choosing the right secure design principles because you've done risk management well. And then the question is, well, what does good risk management look like, and how do I go about doing that? So you're no longer now going to the government to tell them how to do security, because frankly they've breached as much as the rest of us, so should you really be asking them anyway? What you really want to do is say, okay, how do I do good risk management? Well, there are some really great international standards out there. The MOD one, for example, is based on NIST 837, which is their risk management framework. If you come often in the Europe, particularly, people are familiar with ISO 27001, which is again another standard which aligns very well actually with that. So when there's other standards are available, but really, I would advise the underlying point is to make sure you take a structured framework approach to managing risks, and you don't try and make it up for yourself as you go along.
Yeah. And we can talk risks. This is going to be interesting, this one. But I wanted to run a cliche I've past you, which is the phrase "meet the target and miss the point." What I'm getting, George, from what you're saying is a very, very intelligent, backed with a lot of experience approach to how you tackle security. There is a view sometimes when you're working in public sector, particularly if you're I'm not in that capacity anymore, but if I was trying to sell a service into public sector, that I might not be lucky enough to have George reviewing my submission. So you might review the submission and say, well, actually, this paper's absolutely on it. They've got the gist. But the person reviewing it might be wanting much more of your QA person at the end of the process with a tick. So how do you... Is that even a thing, or is it a challenge to try and get these, because bidding in public sector it's an art, isn't it? It's a dark art, and there's the RFPs and all the sort of things you have to do, and you get technicalities, etc. Can you make sure people aren't putting down what you want to see, or really good submissions are being missed because they're not quite in the format, etc.? And by the way, I think this is a slightly unsolvable problem, so it's a really unfair question.
No, it's not unfair at all, I don't think, because it describes effectively the status quo. That is exactly what's happening at the moment. So in government, suppliers will often submit things called risk management accreditation document sets, so they call them RMADs, and then they have risk balance cases, which then take all the vulnerabilities that they've and explain why they're just about acceptable. But all they're really doing is documenting failure, and it's huge, literally sometimes in some cases lorry loads of paperwork documenting failure, highly classified, because they basically effectively form a manual for how to hack the system. And then result in no action, and they just sit there for years, and then in 3 years' time get reapproved. It's not unique to the public sector. I've seen PCI DSS requirements where auditors come around with their clipboards again and say, PSI say you need to patch, and actually an intelligent patching process patches the thing that's most vulnerable and the highest risk, not necessarily all patches. And I'd rather patch really critical risks within 10 minutes than all risks within 24 hours. But people
George,
do.
is really interesting. You should say that. So I've seen some tools that very cleverly look at your vulnerabilities and do exactly that kind of rating.
Yes.
And they also sort of connect everything. So you might have quite a low level risk over here, but it's the equivalent of someone's left the latch off the gate, and actually they can just walk directly into the garden.
Yeah.
It's not as complicated as installing CCTV everywhere, but actually that's the one you need to sort out. So I suppose that's the analogy there is it's a relatively low level patch, but it's got a big vulnerability behind it. On your risk management side of things, so I've seen people really struggle with a risk-based approach. It's almost like I can't actually. I've seen people almost like they can't compute not dealing with this over here because we need to deal with this over here. And I'm wondering, is it because of a lack of understanding of fundamental risk management, or is it because to get risk management really well, you have to understand risk management, but you also have to understand the domain you're in? I don't know.
You almost need to understand the domain you're in and the domain that the person who cares about your domain is in as well. So a good risk, for example, might say, I want to make sure this environment is secure because my bank will lose £1 million a minute as a result. So I've got the impact in it. I need to understand. I've worked with a bank in Luxembourg, I think, and it was. I asked the programmer if your system was hijacked, was hooped, and you couldn't have access to it anymore, how much would you pay the ransomer to get it back? Or if that wasn't possible, how much would it cost the business? He didn't know the answer. So he hadn't done a risk-based approach because in the technical side, hadn't asked the business questions.
Yes.
And risk management ought to be a tool for technical people to communicate to business people. And in reality, I've seen it in many companies. They have a load of commercial risk because the regulator says they have to have commercial risks. And cybersecurity risks are done in a completely different department. And good risk management is about bringing those together. And then I understand why I need cybersecurity.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because I've been in environments where, I think it's called Conway's Law, I think might be 1967. That's definitely before my time, folks. But someone's going to say, no, John, we were shouting at the podcast saying it's something else. But I think it's called Conway's Law, Conway's Rule, which is if you have two teams of anything, two engineering teams, and you put one in one location and one in another, and you get them to work on the same thing, they will create an interface between the two teams. It's just this amazing thing called Conway's. So I think when you talk about operational, the operations team, so keeping things alive and awake and fed and watered, and then you have a separate team doing the security. Again, you can have this sort of weird interface that happens between the two. And when you're really going for it in a critical situation, those two teams can sometimes false positive each other. They can trip each other up. There can be, so I think when you were talking about secure by design, it is also your capability. You should be looking at the way you organize yourselves, the teams that you put together, capability being people, process, and tech, I suppose, in old money, how they all sit together. And that includes how you're going to not just make sure everything security is in at the very early stages, but also how you operate, etc. Do you see that? Is that a thing?
I do, and I think if you get the first stages right, and I think going back to your 10 points that you quoted from the Cabinet Office once, the first principle is really understanding the context. And if you get that right, you've got a good platform for doing everything else, because understanding the context is important for developing your risks. Developing your risks is then important for making decisions about what to do, and all the engineering decisions flow out of that. So in some ways, you can take that list of 10 and just get it down to 2, which is understand why the hell you're doing this, and secondly, manage the risks to that output. And there, it boils down really just to 2 principles. Understand why and understand what,
This is George. He's an essentialist, and he's boiled it down to 2. This is great. By the end of the podcast, we'll get it down to 1 word.
Yeah.
Maybe a number, as long as it's not 42.